being here and for supporting what I think is very fundamental challenges to us as academics, as scientists, and to me in particular as an operations researcher. So I'll tell you a little bit about what operations research is. And as I said, it's about making rational decisions. It's the science of making rational decisions. And it's a field that began during World War II, when there was a concentration of scientists who came from different disciplines, mathematicians, physicists, psychologists, historians, all to focus on preserving their freedom of inquiry and their freedom of expression from a tyrannical force. And that particularly happened in Great Britain, and it happened in the United States. And they used data, they used observations, mathematical analysis, and primitive computing to try to preserve the freedoms that they had, to try to preserve life, in particular in Great Britain. Great Britain was being gradually starved to death by having their ships containing all supplies for that island destroyed during that Second World War. And these scientists came together and looked at this problem and tried to come up with a solution to it by using data, observing, testing, and revising their actions. And that is the process of rational decision making, and that's what led to the beginning of this field. It's a field that involves this articulation of overall goals, comprehensive delineation of alternative actions, the gathering and incorporating of all relevant information, and then continuous observation, revision, and updating of actions. It's a process that now has become ubiquitous in corporations across the world, even in public health decisions. In fact, even the CDC won the top award from my professional organization in operations research for their program to eradicate polio, particularly in India. So based on that success of what I viewed as the general awareness of operations research, systems analysis, and rational decision making, I fully expected that the public reaction to COVID-19 would follow these principles of evidence-based decision making, considering objectives, costs, benefits of all the alternatives, and to all parts of society, and constant revision and incorporation of data. But unfortunately, quite early in the process, as public policy started to coalesce around aggressive lockdowns and closing of schools, I realized that the discipline of principled decision-making was not being followed. Policies of restricting mobility and increasing fear among the populace were supplanting data and measurement. And extrapolations from coarse academic models with no validation were creating a focus on a single target, just effectively limiting the number of new COVID-19 infections that were detected or reported. At that early point in the spring of 2020, we could already predict the consequences of those lockdowns based on studies that have been done in the past.
Professor, could I ask you to speak up a bit so that all of our viewers can watch or can hear?
Okay.
Yeah, a little closer to your face, your mouth. Thank you.
As Scott Atlas and I wrote in May of 2020 with two of our colleagues, Ralph Keeney and Alex Lipton, we could already predict the excess deaths that I think Casey will be describing. At that point, we could already say from what was going on that we were going to face that. It was clear that these policies that were being enacted by local and state governments as well as federal government were not considering all the health consequences, and they're focused on this single target. And it was clear that the optimal decision-making process that my field had been promoting for the past 75 plus years was not being followed. So that was a loss to my field. And I felt that that's something that perhaps my field will be able to recover from. But what about the loss in terms of science in general, or in terms of our ability to use science for decisions? To judge how that has had an effect, I looked at Google Trends, which Google Trends basically records how often people are searching for different terms. And if you look for certain terms like statistics, what you find is that Google Trends actually peaked sometime in 2020, early in the pandemic, and then it declined worldwide. Now it's down about 70%. So statistics, essentially interest in statistics has gone down about 70%. In analytics, which my field often uses as well, the decline has been around 50%. In fact, that decline is even stronger in the United States. In the United States, both those terms are down about 90% since 2020. The only saving grace that I can find in this is that those trends are actually up in some of the places that were referred to. For example, in East Africa. In East Africa, those trends are actually up. Places where they weren't as strict in terms of these COVID mandates as they were in the United States and Western Europe. So we can at least be thankful that in some parts of the world, they've maintained some rationality and perhaps greater trust in science. We may need to depend on having that rationality for whenever we face the next future irrational mandate. Thank you.
Professor Mulligan, do you want to go or do you want to? Okay. No, we're happy to have Dr. Zimberg. It's fine.
Okay, I'm going to speak both about failures and losses in academia. First, I'm going to speak generally and then specifically about economics, which is my field. I'm not a doctor. Don't show me your blood. Now, at the university level, one issue I think is university level, so few were teaching in person. Harvard, Princeton, and Penn were 100% remote. I got to say, I'm very thankful to our provost that she allowed me to teach all my classes in person. But we were not encouraged to do that. And essentially every other economics class in the fall and I believe the winter was on Zoom. Now, this obviously harmed our own students. That's a big loss. But it also encouraged a lot of academia to hold back criticism of the closed grade schools and high schools, which was very damaging. You know, how can you tell your kid's high school chemistry teacher to get in there and teach when you're Zooming it all the time? And so there was a lot of holding back. Education economists didn't have anything to say about all the damage we were doing. The second is, of course, Scott mentioned this, was a lack of critical thinking. It became a progressive thing to say, close schools, require vaccine, et cetera, that so many went along with the party line. Several universities, including this one, gave Dr. Fauci honors and prizes, even though a tiny bit of research would have shown that he was partisan, dishonest, and wrong on the merits. It's interesting to compare with Israel, where those kind of instructions were coming from the government, but it was a right-wing government, and actually a right-wing government that backed it up with real punishments. And much of the population, after the first wave in about June, much of the Israeli population said, this is wrong. And they defiantly went about their business. And you can see it, you don't have to take my word for it, you can see it easily in the mobility data. Israel became a highly mobile society pretty early in the pandemic. Now let me turn to economics. Now, the overwhelming response was that infection is an externality. That's a term of art in economics, and then immediately jump to the draconian straight interventions. The economics of externalities was largely forgotten, such as the work of Elinor Ostrom. She's no right-winger by any means, but she had shown long before the pandemic, she was dead before the pandemic, shown how top-down approaches to externalities so often, not always, but so often, are inferior to local solutions. As James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock put it, the business, firm, or enterprise is the single best example of an institutional arrangement that has as its purpose the internalization of external effects. Our own Ronald Coase was thinking along these lines 90 years ago. But the groupthink in economics was that we should shut down businesses and shut down civil society, forgetting that the big reason in our own field, we say the big reason we have these things is because they alleviate local externalities. And there we were shutting them down. Those are all groups that require the members to obey certain rules. Yes, maybe the rules are a little too tough in some cases, but that's the point of these organizations, is to have rules for the good of the other members. It's true that these institutions weren't originally managing externalities of the disease type. There was other type of externalities. That's why you had a church or what have you. Although I will point out, if you look at the data, where did people get their flu shot most often before the pandemic? We had many seasons of flu shots. They were getting out of work. So actually workplaces were doing something to manage disease, but I understand it wasn't their primary thing. But still, they proved that they had capability to manage local externalities. They had an infrastructure there. They had incentives, and they had resources. So it was wrong for our profession to assume that there was an economics versus safety battle. Very much the economy might have given you the safety. Certainly it's something we should have been discussing rather than wholeheartedly embracing. So really, as a matter of economics, I think, and I was saying in March 2020 already, we should be encouraging people to participate in civil society rather than suggesting that people stay home where, how else can I say it? It's amateur hour in so many dimensions, including disease management. When people were absent from home and work, that's where they got COVID. What else happened when they were absent from home and work? They ate too much, they drank too much, had trouble maintaining their chronic conditions. Many people died because they were not engaging in civil society. Now, there were exceptions in academia. Operation Warp Speed had support from academia. Joel mentioned a little bit of that. Also, our own Michael Kramer was helping on that. Emily Oster, really the government should have been collecting data about schools, but it wasn't. So Emily Oster took upon herself to collect that data, and that was very influential. Universities like Illinois, Champaign, Urbana were innovative. They created their own tests. Now, of course, the government wouldn't allow them to sell the tests to other businesses, but they were doing their part. But on the whole, useful knowledge was quickly forgotten, and advocacy became very political. Thank you.
So the topic today is academia's losses at the hands of COVID mandates. And I think you've gotten an appreciation from the previous speakers that this is a target-rich environment. But I will try to confine my ruminations to the prescribed time, or roughly thereabouts. So the hallmark of academia, especially in science, is free inquiry and rejection of unproven orthodoxies. Indeed, science and medicine thrive on independent inquiry that overturns accepted but erroneous ideas. The academy is supposed to encourage and tolerate vigorous debate. The pandemic replaced that tradition with the demand to follow the science, which of course meant follow the experts, preferably those experts who are politically correct and or of your political persuasion. Never mind that most of the experts during the pandemic, especially in the early days, had no scientific basis for their opinions. In fact, they were often making it up as they went along, regardless of the fact that many of their suggestions had been proposed and tried earlier and shown to have no benefit. Any policymaker or academic who disagreed with those expert dictates to impose and enforce shutdowns, social distancing, masking mandates, and later on generalized vaccine mandates was chastised as an ignoramus and a science denier. You've heard many of those people who suffered that fate are at this conference. Scott Atlas, as you know, was condemned by over 100 of his colleagues at Stanford, who were in health epidemiology and public policy, who accused him of unspecified falsehoods and misrepresentations of science. Another colleague urged the Stanford University Senate to censure him, and of course, a month later, they obliged, condemning him for promoting a view of COVID that contradicts medical science. And what was his crime? He pointed out that total isolation of the entire population is unnecessary and counterproductive, that the accumulated evidence showed that most people, especially those under age 50 and without underlying medical problems, had little or no risk of severe disease or dying. We should focus on protecting the most vulnerable, he said, which included the elderly and those with underlying medical conditions. He had the temerity to suggest that in dealing with COVID, that lockdowns have economic and health costs that must be balanced against the purported health benefits. Those costs include massive unemployment, decreased educational attainment, and excess deaths due to delayed and foregone medical care and increased mental health and substance abuse problems, often resulting in suicide. And these are things that Casey has documented multiple times. And I can tell you, my wife went through the pandemic as a practicing hematologist. She had patients calling up. She would call up the patient and say, "Why did you miss your appointment for chemotherapy?" "I was afraid of catching COVID." Well, your leukemia might have been a little bit more important. You've heard about Jay Bhattacharya. He was guilty of similar thought crimes for publishing the Great Barrington Declaration. And the experts attacked immediately. Tony Fauci dismissed the declaration as unscientific, dangerous, and total nonsense. Dr. Rochelle Walensky, then head of infectious disease at the Massachusetts General Hospital, and of course we know later Joe Biden's CDC director, declared the declaration unsafe. And she joined with other experts in signing a counter manifesto, the John Snow Memorandum, which argued that natural immunity was unproven and continued generalized lockdowns are necessary. We also learned that Jay was censored and shadow banned on Twitter. Law professor Todd Zwicky had to push back against George Mason University's vaccine mandate because he had natural immunity due to an earlier infection that he had documented with multiple antibody tests, but GMU insisted on vaccination anyway. The experts, you see, were pushing vaccination regardless of prior infection. They wouldn't acknowledge the existence of natural immunity, despite the fact that prior to COVID, almost universally, infectious disease doctors said natural immunity is superior to immunity from vaccines. Moreover, as Anthony Fauci admitted in an article a few months ago, there were always good scientific reasons to believe that the vaccines against COVID would be of limited benefit in interfering with transmission, and that their impact would only last for a few months. So, law professor Zwicky sued, the university backed down. But unfortunately, most people don't have his resources. They're not law professors. They can't initiate a lawsuit as readily. And don't have tenure, exactly. So time has confirmed what the experts knew in 2020 and 2021, but would not admit: the limitations of COVID vaccines, and the fact that, as even the CDC and other so-called experts now admit in an article in The Lancet several months back, that, quote, the level of protection afforded by previous infection is at least as high, if not higher, than that provided by vaccination. For me, the most distressing thing and the lesson of the pandemic was how academia and scientific opinion had become so heavily politicized. Ideas and actions were no longer subjected to reasoned examination. They were subject to political litmus tests. Objective science became a function of the scientists' and experts' political worldview. Journals just would not publish opposing views. Academics who rightfully, based on a variety of scientific criteria, which we can get into, questioned the origin of the COVID virus, thinking that it might come from a lab leak, were vilified. And, as we've learned from a variety of email exposures, were pressured under the implied threat of a loss of NIH funding to retract those beliefs and publish articles in prestigious journals doubting the lab leak hypothesis and promoting a natural origin. Anti-lockdown health risks that had been previously deemed intolerable were suddenly manageable or immaterial in the services of a just cause. So, for example, anti-lockdown protesters were labeled as reckless and extreme. Yet many of the experts who objected to anti-lockdown protests urged anti-racism protesters into the streets in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. Former CDC Director Tom Frieden, who had earlier warned against the premature relaxation of shelter-in-place restrictions, minimized the risk of large-scale protests when done for, in his words, the right reasons. A letter drafted by the members of University of Washington's Division of Allergy and Infectious Diseases and signed by more than 1,200 health professionals was explicit. Public gatherings and protests should be allowed and even encouraged for favored causes like Black Lives Matter, and discouraged for disfavored causes, protests of stay-at-home orders, which the letter writers alleged with zero proof were populated by racist white nationalist protesters. For the letter writers, science and public health concerns disappeared for protests, quote, prioritizing an anti-racist message. They stated that, quote, as public health advocates, we do not condemn these gatherings as risky for COVID-19 transmission. We support them as vital to the national public health and to the threatened health, specifically Black people in the United States. But the letter writers continued, quote, this should not be confused with a permissive stance on all gatherings, particularly protests against stay-at-home orders. Those actions not only oppose public health interventions, but are also rooted in white nationalism and run contrary to respect for Black lives. A few months later, something unprecedented occurred. Just before the 2020 presidential election, numerous prestigious scientific journals, including Nature, Scientific American, The Lancet, the New England Journal of Medicine, and Science, all editorialized against then-President Donald Trump. The first three explicitly endorsed his opponent, Joe Biden. Nature was typical. It lambasted Trump, claiming he, quote, flouted and publicly derided the science-based health guidelines set by the CDC for the use of face masks and social distancing. Biden was preferable because he has, quote, pledged that decisions on the pandemic response will be made by public health professionals and not by politicians. They were joined by 81 American Nobel laureates in physics, medicine, and chemistry who signed the letter endorsing Biden. They cited Biden's demonstrated, quote, willingness to listen to the experts. Now, these scientific experts, as I think we know by now, were advocating that policymakers continue to abdicate their duty to balance all the nation's health, economic, and educational considerations in favor of unproven health expert-directed mandates. And the results of these mandates were disastrous. It's remarkable to consider, but that the CDC was not conducting research in spring of 2020, which would have elucidated very quickly who's at risk, what's the potential for various mitigation measures to mitigate that risk, and the potential for vaccines. It just wasn't being done. But unlike many of the experts who were pushing the mandates, you did have people like Dr. Bhattacharya, like Casey Mulligan, who actually did empirical research analysis showing that the mitigation policies, the lockdowns, did little or nothing to improve health, and in some cases decreased it. Casey and I recently co-authored a study with colleagues at the Paragon Health Institute that compared an index of government mitigation measures independently compiled by the Oxford University Business School, and we found that across the 50 states, lockdown severity had little or no impact on health outcomes, but it was strongly correlated with poor economic and educational outcomes. Of course, the remarkable thing about the endorsements I described earlier was that they came at a time that science, with strong support from the public-private partnerships initiated by the Trump administration, was closing in on an historic achievement: the creation of new vaccines for a novel virus in 10 months. Vaccine development normally takes 10 years. And the endorsements also came at this time that candidates Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were undermining public confidence in the new Trump vaccines. Academia's failure to function as an honest broker of conflicting ideas and willingness to descend in politically motivated advice has undermined the whole process of scientific inquiry and destroyed the public's faith in the academy. Nature's editors, in their endorsement, claimed that one of their reasons for that endorsement was to, quote, restore trust in science. So a recent study in Nature Human Behavior showed that it had the opposite effect. Political endorsements by high-profile scientific journals like Nature undermined and polarized public confidence in the endorsing journals and in the scientific community. The result that we have now, public confidence in science and medical organizations is at an all-time low. So the moral of the story is that when academic scientists use their positions as faculty or editors at prestigious universities and journals to pursue partisan problems that are best decided through the political process, people lose trust in academia.
Thank you. Do we have time for one question for them? Okay. You've all touched on the political issues that have materialized for anyone to see in the last 5 to 10 years. There's also the monetary issues that you've touched on as well, right? The amount of money that universities take. It's striking to me that university leadership didn't listen to people like yourselves. Why do you think this happened? How did this happen? That you were, I know there's been studies recently showing that, I think there was one just done at Harvard about a year or so ago that found that they surveyed all of the professors, and I think only 1 or 2% were actually identified as conservatives. Whereas historically, maybe 30 or 40 years ago, the number would have been, roughly half and half, or maybe slightly more towards the left side. What has happened? How has our society been transformed? And how is it that people like yourselves are speaking out and yet it was falling on deaf ears? Can you just, what would you posit? Putting you on the spot.
I think there is a feeling that if you are one of the 1%, that you can't make any changes because there's 99% who are up against you. I had people come to me sort of on the side and say, oh, what you're saying is really great, but they weren't going to say it themselves. And maybe we don't know how many people there are who are actually free thinkers. But we have those of us who are and who recognize that we need to express ourselves and encourage others. I think maybe we didn't do enough of that.
Yeah, I think it was part of a more generalized trend towards ideological and viewpoint diversity. There's a generalized trend towards intolerance on all sorts of issues. I went to Swarthmore College, nicknamed Kremlin on the Crumb many years ago. And there's no question it was a left-leaning place. But I was sort of middle of the road. I was a raging conservative in their eyes, but I was middle of the road. But no one bothered me or in any way tried to censor me. Now, granted, I was an economics major, and they were all Keynesians, but they were actually a pretty moderate group of guys. But there was no problem. But that's not the case anymore. You cannot express your opinion freely on a whole host of issues. So I think this was just one of the issues. I think there's the added problem in the scientific community that they had a real sword held over their head of losing funding. So when the people who wrote to Anthony Fauci via email and suggested very early on, hey, there's this SARS-CoV-2 virus looks kind of weird. There are features of it that make it look like maybe it's man-made. This could have been a result of a lab leak. The Fauci and Collins and others circled the wagon and wrote and had phone conversations with them and email exchanges. And within a few days, these folks had changed their tune and then were publishing other articles, just the reverse. So there was a very clear threat to you. If you wanted to continue in academic medicine or in science, you better toe the party line.
Thank you. Professor Mulligan, any thoughts? Not to put you in. Okay, perfect. Yeah, go ahead, Arthur. And I also just want to say, maybe you can touch on this. It seems that social media plays a huge role in this because social media has effectively siloed us into our echo chambers. The algorithms feed you what you want to see and hear and read about, and they actually downplay what you may not be as open to. And this just exacerbates the situation, but it's also facilitated cancel culture, right? People now hide behind a screen and they will say things they would never say to your face. And so I'm just wondering how maybe you can talk about this, Arthur, about how this maybe played a role in your experience here at university.
Sure. So I think first, just on the education and academia piece. So this panel is titled Academia's COVID Failures, but I think if we go to the root of the problem, it doesn't lie in this COVID era. It's academia's failures in general. And if we look at what secondary education writ large in this country looks like now, it's very professionalized. It's, okay, how do I get to Wall Street quicker? How do I get this consulting job quicker? It's this alliance of big academia, big government, big tech, big finance, big pharma. And it's not what it should be. And Professor Abbott, you invoked Aristotle earlier, and I think you're very apt to do that, is we should have a revival of classical education, one that points to what is good, true, and beautiful. And Aristotle said education is for the cultivation of virtue. And we don't have that anymore in college. We don't really have that in high school. And with the select few classical elementary schools, we don't have that at a younger level. So I think the reason why we ended up in this place in the collegiate atmosphere is really a failure on what the value of education, what education should be writ large. And then briefly on the social media point, my generation is in hot water, I think, because of the proliferation of all these social media apps. You see it with TikTok, Twitter, Instagram. It's the dissemination of information really lies on who controls these apps, as we see Dr. Bhattacharya was shadow banned. So I think we have to figure out a way to get our message out, because it's very easy for those in power to send their message out and drown us out. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I don't think we have any time for more questions, do we? Okay, super. Todd.
Casey mentioned COS. One observation that I've drawn from the last few years, there are no COSians in a pandemic, apparently. But there's a larger point here for the panel, consider maybe you and Joel particularly, which is there are two ways like you could deal with COVID, right? You can like repress everybody else, or you can stay home, right? I mean, basically that's the deal, right? You can make everybody wear a mask on a plane or buy a car, and leave me alone. But basic point is somewhere along the way, and this I think is the logic of the Great Barrington Declaration, right? It's basically a Coasian logic, right, of how we mitigate the total social cost of this, even the cost of transmission. So one of the things that's very striking to me that that's related to that is what about the fact that, we talk about age, but we also know being fat, that's the big risk factor here, right? People who don't exercise, who are 30 pounds overweight. Somebody said earlier, college students put on an average 28 pounds, right? Whatever happened to the idea of people taking personal responsibility for this rather than controlling everybody else's what they're doing?
I have a question about the Great Barrington Declaration. It comes from your question, which is, America had vulnerable people before the pandemic. They had their chronic conditions. They're trying to manage them. We've all tried to manage weight, etc., cholesterol, blah, blah, blah. And so keeping the vulnerable people home, to me, has a potential harm, because those are the people who, to manage their health, they have partners who are outside the home, whether it be a AA group, or going to their doctor, or just getting out and talking to people. So I'm not so sure that the vulnerable people should have been staying home. But for sure, I think we can agree this information should have been provided. We should have been telling people, look, you're overweight. You've been trying to manage that. Keep trying to manage it. Or like the leukemia, keep doing that. This is not a time to drop the ball on your health. And maybe let people decide, I'm vulnerable if I get COVID, but I'm also vulnerable if I don't get my treatment or my AA group or whatever. That's kind of how I think about it. It's really information and allow people to decide because they all have their own issues and challenges.
Can I address that real quick? Yeah, because I think that if you read the declaration, it's we try to be as clear as we could. This is not concentration camps for older people. The idea was resources and ideas and information and for and organization of social structures to support older people who are at high risk to be able to protect themselves if they could. Right. So like we had DoorDash delivering food to young laptop class professionals. If we're going to spend trillions of dollars, why not have DoorDash deliver food to older people living at home, or organize communities to deliver food to people at home, to vulnerable people at home. It would have been different in every community. Really, the Great Barrington Declaration was an invitation to public health and communities at large to discuss how best to do that. It was going to be very different in South Central LA than it was going to be in Manhattan or something, right? And so I think that co-scene idea was absolutely at the heart of it. It was not, how could three people, even Stanford, Harvard, Oxford, have the right way to organize all of that? It's just impossible. It was an invitation to a discussion that was shut down.
Yeah, the thing that came to mind with your question was that one thing that was never entered the minds of most of the policymakers was the concept of economic epidemiology, which is originated with our friend and colleague Tomas Philipson, that people actually do respond to risks, and they do it without the government. And there's an awful lot of literature indicating that in prior pandemics and in this pandemic, people responded way before the government imposed mandates, and they were much better at determining their own risks and saying, I need to avoid gatherings, or I need to stay home, or I need to do X, Y, and Z, much better than the government, much more nimble at doing it, better at assessing when their risks were no longer relevant. And that all that happened with the government mandates was you got all the deleterious effects, and basically all the benefits that one might have gotten from these sort of mitigation measures, you'd already gotten through people's own voluntary actions.
The other thing is, are we going to regulate sugar consumption? Are we going to put vitamin D in the water? Where does personal responsibility? I'm totally with you. People have to take responsibility. That said, government programs subsidizing cheap garbage food like processed carbohydrates and industrial oils are extremely damaging and make us fat. And where are those foods most available? Inner cities, less affluent communities. In the back, sir?
Real quick, Mark Weidermiller. I'm just a regular person living in Chicago, advocating for medical freedom. But on your film, I looked it up on Wikipedia. It calls it an anti-vax propaganda film. And then I looked up The Inconvenient Truth, and that's called an American documentary. So I'm wondering how can we possibly, and I use Wikipedia for everything. This is on Wikipedia. So how can we control the narrative more? Is there any hope about that?
Is that directed to me or the panel?
Oh, to you.
Okay. So I know people like investigative journalist Cheryl Atkinson. They constantly, there's a team, right? They have a huge team of people who control Wikipedia. And I, not very affectionately, call it the CIA fact book because I think that's a more apt name for it. But basically, if you go in and you try and change something, someone will change it back in 30 seconds. Cheryl Atkinson has written about how she corrected things that were written about her. This was an award-winning CBS journalist, investigative journalist. She would correct it, and then she appealed these corrections, and she was told that she was not a good source or a valid source of information on herself. Literally. And I'm sharing this because, what we're dealing with is truly organized media, technology, on a level that I think that most of us can't possibly comprehend. And that's why I mentioned the Trusted News Initiative and the Nudge Committee, because they're very organized coalitions of groups. Many of them connect to the pharmaceutical industry, and they do hit pieces on physicians and scientists and academics like these gentlemen who put their neck out, and they will take them down. I watch it happen over and over in the more than 15 years that I've been involved in the whole health freedom arena. You know, we won an award from the School of Public Health at the University of Alabama, and then we got literally slammed by the New York Times, but the New York Times literally lied about it. I wrote about a chapter in a book about what they did. And this is, I think that the only solution is for us to be aware that this is happening and to choose the sources from which we derive our information. Because if you are just looking at the mainstream, you are likely getting something that is highly curated and highly biased. Okay, I need to end there. Thank you so much.